Speaker. Nigel Richardson is the Director of Children's Services at Leeds City Council in the UK, and since joining in 2010 he has successfully led that service through a period of significant change and transformation, with the result of children and young people in Leeds being placed at the heart of the city and the city's growth strategy. Married with 4 sons, also a grandfather, using his extensive experiences in the UK, will you please make welcome Nigel Richardson, presenting his keynote, "There's a Picture on My Fridge, Transforming Life Chances, How Serious Are We?"
Hi. Well, there's no pressure then, so thanks for that. Thanks for the introduction. Thanks for that welcome to country, a beautiful welcome to country, and you know, children are the future, children are our future leaders. Nothing better. I'm just going to work out the technology. Michael, if I just click it once, is that going to work? Yeah? Do I not go back to the title? I'm on it. Ah, brilliant. Yeah. Don't look behind me. You could say it's behind you. It's behind you. Okay, we're ready to go. Thanks also to Sharon Dutton and the team, who, you know, these things don't happen by accident, these events, and I think Sharon stalked me for about a year, and somehow or other managed to convince me that it wasn't that far. So, so thanks for that. Also, importantly, thanks to you. Thanks to you for what you do day in, day out to improve the life chances of the next generation. There is probably no more important work, and so I personally thank you for that. Here's the deal. I want to tell you a story. I want to share that story. There's some information that you can have, after the keynote, if it makes sense, and if it's useful to you in your journey around Every Child Succeeds. And the journey that you've been on, and the things that we've been that have been explained to us earlier on this morning. I'm going to try and tell you a story that's quite simple. Hopefully, it makes common sense, uses a bit of a common language, plain language, and hopefully, it will be useful to you. And you can hold me to account in terms of that when we get to the end. I'm going to talk for about an hour-ish before somebody starts to rugby tackle me off the stage, but hopefully, we'll have 10 minutes or so to facilitate some questions. But I'm here for the 2 days as well, happy to engage in any of that dialogue with you. So there's a picture on my fridge. Now, there is actually a picture on my fridge. And this is the picture on my fridge. I'm not going to show you what's in the fridge because that's embarrassing, but we'll concentrate on the picture on the fridge. And I want you to look at the picture in the top right-hand corner of this slide. And there's a group of children. This is a picture taken in Africa, a little village called Abobo just outside Abidjan on the Ivory Coast. And I'd ask you to look at the little girl in the middle. And what you can see there, the building behind is a school that's being constructed, okay, in Abobo. And the group of children there were quite wanted to have the photographs taken. But the little girl in the middle, the taller one, with the hair in a bunch, she's called Jolie. And she's the sister of a girl called Victoria Climbié. Victoria Climbié was the subject to a horrible, brutal torture and murder in the UK. And it was quite a symbolic case for us. It was a watershed moment for UK legislation. And I was privileged enough to be part of the public inquiry, a major public inquiry chaired by somebody called Lord Laming. And it was a landmark case. And it started to look at what had happened on the journey from Ivory Coast to London and to an untimely death of Victoria as an 8-year-old child. And the deal was this, that the family, Victoria's family, would pick a bright and intelligent little girl like Victoria out of their family, and they would travel with a member of the family to Europe in search of a better education, or in search of any education, actually. And in pursuit of that education, the sad fact is that Victoria never ever set foot in a school in the UK. So she never returned. The plan was she'd get her education, she'd return to Ivory Coast, and she'd help the family and community grow with the benefit of her education. But she never made it, and it became one of the most key cases and focal points for national government, for legislation, as to how could this possibly happen. Because Victoria was known to a number of social services departments, she was known to a number of hospitals, she was known to the police force, she was known to the NSPCC in the UK, and yet she still ended up murdered in quite an awful set of circumstances in a flat at 267 Somerset Gardens in London. And part of that inquiry told us, if I can click it. I've stopped clicking, Michael. Where's he gone? Tell you what, I'll use... is it that one? That one. Okay. It told us there were 128 injuries on Victoria's body. The pathologist said it was probably one of the worst cases of child abuse and neglect that he'd ever seen in his life. I was also fortunate enough during that inquiry. I won't go into the detail of the inquiry and what happened to Victoria. I'll touch on it a little bit throughout the presentation, because it is important that we understand these stories and we learn from them. But I was also fortunate enough to meet Victoria's parents, who came over to the UK to try and understand what on earth had happened to their daughter, and they are having to deal with the most awful set of circumstances. And I learnt a huge amount from Victoria's parents, not only in terms of humility and integrity and respect, but also that there was an untapped resource that was there waiting to help Victoria, that nobody in the UK knew anything about whatsoever. And that was something called family. And there was a huge family out in Ivory Coast that would have been there to help Victoria. But the way we were set up in the UK, the way we approach the provision of services in the UK at the time, did not allow us to explore what family meant to children and what family meant in reality. And I ask you to think about family in its widest possible sense. I'm going to come back to that later on. Not just a traditional narrow view of family, but family in its widest possible sense, as an untapped resource that perhaps organisationally and systemically we've not yet learnt how to use to its full effect to help safeguard and promote the welfare of children. Lord Laming produced a report that was quite a thick document. It is a story. I'd urge you to go back and read the story. It had 105 recommendations, maybe more than that. So it was a very big document to work your way through. But in a nutshell, Lord Laming's report can be crystallised into 3 statements. And these are 3 statements I'd ask you to think about in your work and in the conversations you're going to have for the rest of the day. And these are 3 statements that have helped us hugely in terms of our work in Leeds in trying to safeguard and promote the welfare of children moving forward. Now, first of all, this idea of doing the simple things better. In Victoria's case, the simple things weren't even done at all, let alone better. But it's the simple things that make the biggest difference to the lives of children. You think about the work that you're involved in where you've made a difference to the life of a child, it will be something simple that you've done. You've turned up on time, you've done what you said you're going to do. It's the simple things that make the biggest difference. But also when you think about organisations, it's the simple things that make the biggest difference. We have a problem. You won't have this problem in Tasmania, you won't have this problem at all. But in the UK, and in Leeds in particular, we are stunningly brilliant, world-class leaders at taking a simple idea and making it insanely complicated. And we take a simple idea and we put a layer on top of a layer on top of a layer on top of a layer, and then we wonder why nothing's working in the way that we thought. Like I said, you won't have that problem. But you want to think about how do you keep things as simple as possible without ignoring the complexity of what it is that you're working with. So simple but not simplistic is something I'd ask you to think about. The second point in Lord Laming's report, the second theme, was this idea of the child as the client. Director of Children's Services, the Children Act, lead member for Children's Services, the clues in the title. We exist in the roles that we exist in to work on behalf of children. Our professional responsibility is to work on behalf of children. In how many cases, and Victoria's case was a classic case, Victoria was never hidden. Until it got near the end of her short life, she was always on display, she was always available, she was always there. But she was behind Marie-Therese Quau. The adult always spoke on her behalf. The adult always framed the story. The adult gave the explanations. The adult told the story to the other professionals. We have a professional responsibility to be respectful of the adult's view of the world, of the context that that adult and the role that adult plays in the life of a child. But we have an absolute responsibility to listen to the voice of the child, to have a direct conversation with that child or that young person and understand what's it like to be that child or young person in that particular set of circumstances. It's the job. It's the law of the land in a way because of the way the legislation is set up in the UK. But if you just think about your job title, if you think about what you're trying to do, if you think about every child succeeds, the child has to be the client, the centre of what you do. And the third strand was this idea of being able to articulate how what you do day in, day out, what you're about to do, how you're about to intervene in the life of a child is going to demonstrably help you safeguard and promote the welfare of that child. And think about those words. We have a collective responsibility in this work to safeguard and promote the welfare of children. Therefore, the professional work you're doing, you should be able to articulate how what you're about to do is going to actively help safeguard and promote the welfare of that child, those children, that community, those families. If you can articulate that in simple terms, then do more of it. If you can't, then maybe we need to take a step back, take a deep breath and think again about what is it we're trying to do and how is it demonstrably going to safeguard and promote the welfare of children. So I offer you those three things just to think about. They've been extremely useful to us because this work is complicated. You live in a complicated world. This work is probably some of the most complicated work that's available. Safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children, child protection, safeguarding responsibilities. So hanging on to some simple constructs, simple mindsets can be helpful. When Councillor Burr, a senior politician in Leeds, when I was fortunate enough to be offered the opportunity to take on the job as Director of Children's Services in Leeds, we used to argue about this book. It's by E.M. Forster. It's called Howard's End. I used to think it was a dreadfully dull book. Councillor Blake used to think it was a wonderful book. But we both, and no offence to any English scholars in the room, if it is your favourite book, but it is dull. But there is a great quote in there. We both agree that this quote is worth its weight in gold. Only connect. Because everything I'm going to talk to you about, everything that you do that works on behalf of children, I would argue is much, much more about connections, relationships and conversations than it will ever be about structures, procedures, policies and processes. And the amount you're able to invest in those connections, conversations and relationships will pay you back hugely in terms of the work you're able to do to safeguard children. It's connections and relationships and conversations that wrap themselves around and create safeguarding nets and safeguarding networks for children. There's another phrase further on in the quote, says, live in fragments no longer. And think how difficult it is for different agencies and different organisations to break out of their silos and work together. Don't live in fragments. Safeguarding multi-agency endeavours help safeguard children. No agency, no individual can do it on their own. And the reason those connections and conversations are important is because of this. Everything is simple. It's people who complicate things. It's people who complicate things. So I'd ask you to think about that as we move forward in this conversation. But before we go any further, here's the most important picture you're going to see today. This is our granddaughter, Violet. This is Violet Aurora. Already asking the right questions. Tell me about child-friendly Leeds, Grandpa. Now, Violet is now 2. Where did that go? Where did that time go? She's now 2. And I used to think, I still have this belief that the behaviour of adults has a massive impact on the behaviour of children. However, for the last 2 years, watching Violet grow up over those 2 years and watching her ability to manipulate the behaviour of adults around her, I'm having to sort of rethink that a little bit. But the big thing about Violet now is she's got this thing called the face, and she likes to pull a funny face. And pulling a funny face instigates a set of reactions from the adults around her, and if she pulls a funny face, everybody has to pull a funny face. So when I told her and I explained on the map where I was going and how near it was from the UK to get to here in Tasmania, she wanted to send you a funny face. So are you ready? This is Violet's funny face, especially for you. And that's exactly the reaction she wants. She'll be so pleased. So thank you for that. Also, at the same time, even though, in terms of the journey, the colleagues in Leeds are really pleased to be sharing this story with you. And if I had an Australian dollar for every person who wanted to come with me, I'd be very, very rich. But they've sent you a message.
Hello from Leeds. Hello from Leeds. We are very ambitious in Leeds. We want to be the best city in the UK. To be the best city in the UK, we have to be the best city for children and young people growing up. That is at the heart of our ambition, to be a child-friendly city.
Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds. Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds.
One thing that we're really challenged with and will deliver on is a Leeds being a child-friendly city.
Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds.
Hello from Leeds.
Okay, so hello from Leeds. So you get an idea of the size of Leeds, third biggest city in the UK, second biggest city outside London. We don't really count London, it's not really a city, it's just a collection of little places. And so, and when 2009 the inspectors came, we have a statutory arm of government that inspects every single children's services in the country. In 2009 Leeds fell over badly and got the message it did not want to receive, that it was not, children in Leeds were not safe. Were not safe. And I don't have to explain to you, but that sort of message has huge repercussions in terms of the political fallout, what it means for staff morale, what it means for children and young people themselves, what it means for public confidence, what it means for the media, etc., etc. So that's where we were. I was appointed in 2010, and the basic remit was very complicated and elaborate. Sort it. People just wanted it sorting out. We did not want to be in this place as a city. Councillor Blake and I started to work together on this agenda, and I'd urge you to think about this question. Everything we did was geared towards this one question. What's it like to be a child or young person growing up in Leeds today? What's it like? Because it's different. Leeds is a big city. It's the best part of 900,000 people. It'll probably break 1 million shortly. We've now got 187,000 children and young people in the city because of the inward investment and the growth. But it's different. It's different for all those children in different parts of Leeds. And it's different again in each of those different parts of Leeds. There's a thing I'd ask you to think about as well called child carer context. Child carer context. Every child has a different context. We have a professional responsibility, I would argue, to understand that context. What's it like to be a child or young person in that particular set of circumstances, in that particular part of the city now? Because then you can start to understand the second part of the question, how do we make it better? How do we make it better? And these questions are never ending. The day anybody says to you that Leeds is a child-friendly city and the job's done, then we're in trouble. You've got to keep that ambition and keep pushing the boundaries a little bit further. We also got into this conversation about this idea of trying to match physical regeneration of a place, because there were huge conversations going on in Leeds about the physical regeneration of the city. Inward investment, growth, superfast broadband, transport networks, housing, all those infrastructure conversations that you're probably familiar with over here, but very little about the social regeneration that has to sit alongside it. So part of our remit was say, well, we've got two choices here. We've got two choices. We've got a broken child protection system. We can either just concentrate on that and fix it, do some repair work, or we can take us, and things will get better, or we take a step back and decide we're going to be significantly more ambitious than that. We're going to be transformational. We're going to try and do something that is long-term and sustainable and demonstrably improves the life chances of the next generation. And what if children became the heart of the growth strategy of Leeds as a city? What if we were able to match the physical regeneration agenda with a social regeneration agenda, with the centrality of children to the growth of the city at the heart of everything that we did, and try and make those conversations come together so that when people are talking about the physical regeneration, they're also talking about the social regeneration. And we started to put this idea together that children live in families, because they do. And family will mean different things to different people, as I said earlier on. But those families create communities, and those communities create cities or places or geographies. And trying to put that argument alongside the physical regeneration suddenly opened up a whole new debate across the city of Leeds, with more than just the usual suspects coming together to sort out a child protection problem. Actually, all the city wanted to be part of this idea of physical regeneration matched by social regeneration. What if we could actually get something mobilised around that? Because everything has a context, and in the UK, the notion of family has changed. It's not a traditional construct of family anymore. It's not the death of family. It just means family means different things to different people. And we've got a responsibility to understand what that difference means to different people, and particularly what it means through the eyes of a child. This is hard-nosed evidence. I'm not going to go through it now. You can have copies of the slides. But this is the social construct or the social context of family in the UK. It's changing. There are additional pressures and strains on families. But this is hard evidence that we know. And we also know there are things like this, what we would call family risk factors. Stuff that's not causal. It doesn't cause bad outcomes for children as they grow up, but it increases the likelihood, or it can increase the likelihood of poor outcomes. And some of the introductory comments that we heard this morning play into your evidence of what it's like for a child or young person growing up in this particular area, and some of this contextual pressure that's there, this context that's really important. And we also know that on my clicker, can you click it on, Michael? For whatever reason, I've stopped clicking again. We've got risks for young people, things that come together in an unhelpful way, not causal again, but things that come together in unhelpful ways that can make a difference and have a negative impact on the life chances of the next generation. Leaving school with no qualifications, involvement in crime, alcohol, drugs, stuff you know, but important to understand. And hang on to that bit, it's not causal. Because there are some good news. Protective factors, things that somehow or other come together, even in conditions of extreme adversity, to protect children. Even in conditions of extreme adversity, these things come together. You think about all the projects you're involved in, all the work that you've done that you're really pleased about. I would argue quite strongly that components or parts of these protective factors are in play in the schemes and initiatives and programmes and pieces of work that you've been involved in. So how do we get more of this stuff into play? Or put it another way, it's how children grow up. It's how they experience things around them that has the biggest impact on their life chances as they grow up. And important to understand that. So we started to put all this context together, and we started to put an argument out across the city. Well, what if? What if this became an organisational imperative, that we did something on a city-wide scale? What if Leeds became recognised as one of the world's first child-friendly cities? And not just a child-friendly city in the sense that let's be nice to children, because why wouldn't you be? But a child-friendly city that had a bit of a hard-nosed economic regeneration strategy attached to it. If we get this right, if we disproportionately invest wisely in the next generation, then the economy of the city has a fighting chance of sustainable long-term growth. If we get it wrong, the city might look better, but the economy might fall over and destabilise itself later on. And that economic model started to bring lots of other people to the table with an interest in the growth of Leeds. What if we could negotiate a new social contract in our relationship between the state and the citizens, i.e. children and families, that had more emphasis on the centrality of children and the importance of family as an untapped resource that we hadn't yet used to its full extent. And what if we did start to recognise family, the importance of family, as the most important, however you describe family, the most important, but the most forgotten, the most underused, the most underinvested in utility of the 21st century? What if we realise we're sat on a rich resource that we've not yet fully understood, and we started to work differently about that? So we had to have a plan. Then we took advice from Spike Milligan, who said you should never plan anything because then nothing can ever go wrong. And it's very tempting, very tempting. But then the plan was child-friendly city. This idea of Leeds as a child-friendly city, child-friendly Leeds, which we've talked about. And here's the plan. And you've got copies of the plan on your seat. You're either sat on it or you've knocked it on the floor, but there is a copy of the plan there. And there's a little bit of origami for you to just fold it into 3, and you've got a little handout that you can carry with you. And that was the purpose. First thing I'd ask you to think about is, how many plans have you seen? This is our entire Children and Young People's plan, and it's a plan on a page. That idea of something that's simple but not simplistic. Something that can grab people's attention, they can stick it on the wall, they can reference back to it, so they can be reminded of what it is we've agreed as a city to do. And part of a consultation around the city to design that plan, which I can talk about a little bit more later on. One vision for Leeds to be a child-friendly city, the centrality of children to the growth strategy of the city. One partnership. I'd ask you to think about this. A top table, one top table, alongside all the other top tables that you'll have in your particular jurisdiction, in your particular governance arrangements. But the key is one top table, chaired by Councillor Judith Blake at the time as a senior politician, the deputy leader of the council. But it's a top table where there is a citywide conversation about children. About children. What's it like to be a child or young person growing up in Leeds today, and how do we make it better? One plan, which is the plan on the page that you've got there to try and keep it simple. 5 outcomes. I'd ask you to think about this. You've got your 6, and I commend you for that. I commend you for that. But don't lose them. Make sure everybody knows them. Make sure everybody can understand what they are. We only went for 5 because it gets too complicated for me if I go off, beyond 5 and have to go on more than one hand. But we had 5 outcomes, and an outcome is a condition of well-being. A condition of well-being you want for part of that population or for a whole population, all children, for example. And it's a condition of well-being you should be able to express in a sentence, keeping it as simple as possible, plain language, common language, useful, etc. All children and young people in Leeds are safe from harm. All children and young people in Leeds make healthy lifestyle choices. All children and young people in Leeds do well in learning and have skills for life. All children and young people in Leeds have fun growing up. They enjoy their childhood. All children and young people in Leeds are active citizens who feel they have a genuine voice, and that voice has an influence. That voice has an influence. And that's it. That's the Children and Young People's Plan. That's what a child-friendly city, a child-friendly Leeds means. It means contributing to one or more of those conditions of well-being we want for all 187,000 children as it is now. And you'll notice when you look at this slide and you look at the one you've got on paper, you can find in 6 years it's only had one change. And that one change is we've gone from 12 priorities to 14 priorities. And that's because a lot of the evidence over the last 6 years told us we probably weren't doing enough about social, emotional, mental health issues amongst young people. And we started to put that into the plan. But fundamentally, we've held our nerve and not changed the plan. The usual rule of local government, certainly in the UK, is you change your plan every 5 minutes. If it lasts a year, 18 months, you're lucky, and then you're on to the next thing and you think of another one. Holding your nerve, this stuff is not quick fix. It takes time, and it takes a collective will to hold your nerve and move things forward that way. Because out of the 5 outcomes, we locked ourselves away with a ridiculous amount of data. You'll have too much data as well. And we said, well, let's not boil the ocean. Let's not boil the ocean, because we're just not going to be able to do that. Let's just pick 12 things. 12 things originally that we're not doing very well at. 12 things that against the 5 outcomes where we're struggling a bit when you compare Leeds to everywhere else. And it was the usual suspects around health outcomes, education attainment, child protection, youth crime, etc. Not unusual, but let's just agree a short list where we can try and do something to make a difference and mobilise the city behind that. But then here's the thing to think about. What if we were brave enough? We're not going to boil the ocean, we're only going to pick 12, but what if we're brave enough just to pick 3 things? What if we just pick 3 things as a city to disproportionately focus on? We started to talk about what if we could just obsess on these 3 things. 3 things that would make a big difference. Working on the theory that if you start somewhere, it takes you everywhere else. So it doesn't matter where you start, just start somewhere. It will take you everywhere else. Everything's connected to everything else. So what if we could safely and appropriately reduce the need for children to be looked after by the state? What you call, as I understand it, out-of-home care. We had too many kids in Leeds who were taken from their families and looked after elsewhere, and it was poor outcomes for children as they grew up and a huge expense to the public purse. Not sustainable, not sustainable. What if we could have more of those children growing up safely and appropriately in their own family network? Secondly, school attendance. Education is an entitlement for our children when they reach school age. When I arrived in Leeds and said, well, let's have a look at school attendance, everybody said, don't worry about school attendance, Nigel, it's 90 odd percent. It's okay, 90 odd percent. When we worked out what the odd percent was, it was 92%. When you work out what does 92% mean in terms of children, well, that means on any one school day in Leeds, there would be 8,000 children not in school. Now, are we happy with that? No, we're not happy with that. The good reason for some children not to be there, short-term illness, family holiday, etc., etc., but a huge number of kids potentially running the risk of becoming invisible. So you might want to think about that. But school, what do we do about improving school attendance? It's an entitlement. If kids are in school, you've got extra eyes and ears around the safeguarding agenda while they're in school as well. And the third obsession was destinations. What happens to our young people when they finish their schooling? They grow up and they move on having left school. And we had too many kids in Leeds, young people who'd left school, and they ended up not in education, employment or training. Something we horribly call in the UK NEETs, and it's 16 to 18-year-olds. In other words, you've gone through all your schooling and you're doing nothing. You're not in education and employment. Now, if this is part of an economic strategy, how useful is that? That's not useful. So what could we do to get more young people leaving school and going on to a positive destination so they're actively engaged in employment, education or training when they leave school? And what if we just concentrate on those 3 things? And here's the thing, and another thing you'll find out about Leeds is we like a good list. If you just take the lists of those kids who are looked after by the state, who have chronically bad school attendance, who have poor destinations when they leave school, surprise, surprise, in the main, it's the same kids, it's the same families. Start somewhere, it will take you everywhere else. So just trying to get that basic information to mobilise activity. Because then we had a structure alongside the ambition and the plan. There's a simple structure that does that. It's centrally held at the top table I talked about earlier on, and it simply drops into 25 recognisable geographical areas across the city of Leeds. Because Leeds is a big place. You can't do it all centrally. You have to devolve it out into those local areas. And they were 25 what we call clusters. And you might want to call them something else in your jurisdiction, that's absolutely fine. But they were local geographical areas that made sense to local people and local professionals. And they were usually centred around secondary school, partner primary schools, children's centres, health resources, police resources, third sector, voluntary sector resources, everything coming together. So in a way mirrors the top table down in those 25 areas. And it's not perfect, and some of the boundaries don't match, and some of the things overlap, but it's good enough. And I'd urge you to think about that. Do not wait for perfection. Just get something that's good enough and start with it, because that gets you momentum, and you'll find enough people that are like-minded to come on board with it. but they've got a sense of purpose that goes with that. But the key thing is the data goes from the top table down to the 25, so you have localised data. So each of those 25 clusters know how many kids live in this area, how healthy are they, how safe are they, how well they're doing at school, how much fun are they having, how much of a voice have they got. Support the positive, respond to the negative. And just keep that flow of conversations going back and forth. Okay? And we invested in 3 behaviours which I'll say something about now. If we believe it's connections, relationships and conversations, it'd be mad to have a plan that didn't invest in human interaction and the way that human relationships were going to be expected to evolve moving forward. Put schools at the heart of local communities as the heartbeat of a local community around those clusters. And here's the thing, if you think about it in these terms, on a rough calculation in Leeds at that time, we thought there were at least 75,000 people in the city of Leeds who day in, day out touch the lives of the 180,000 children and young people we were talking about at the time. What if you could mobilise 75,000 people against a simple idea or a plan like this? What difference would you make to the outcomes for the next generation? This is One Direction, big child-friendly Leeds fans, as you can see. Sharon insisted I put this slide up. Each email she said, you will bring the One Direction slide, won't you? But this is just to show you, anybody who comes into the city of Leeds now who's remotely famous, we get them to do a film, a thumbs up, a little video message to kids. For reasons best known to themselves, children and young people in Leeds would rather listen to these guys than me, for some reason or other. Don't know. Here's the 3 behaviours. It's mobilising the collective effort, resources you probably don't think you've got, but you've got there to help you on this journey. A big emphasis on talking to, listening to and responding to children. There's a key behaviour that a bunch of our staff were amazingly brilliant at, but a bunch of our staff were amazingly not brilliant at. But if the child is the client, if the focal point is the voice of the child, if you want to understand what it's like to be a child or young person growing up in Leeds, you've got to get more people more skilled at talking to, listening to and responding to children. And so that was one explicit behaviour that we invested in as part of the plan. This idea of restorative practices, you may be familiar with the idea of restorative justice, the repairing of harm, the resolving of conflict. What we tried to do there was try and take some of the principles of a restorative justice approach and put it into this idea of restorative practice. Could you create the conditions where you stop things going wrong in the first place? And the basic argument was, if we did more things with people, as opposed to doing things to them, for them, or doing nothing at all, in a construct of high support and high challenge, could we make more progress? And what we found in the UK, and particularly in Leeds, all our regulations, guidance, processes, etc., were geared towards doing things to families. Do this or else. Doing things for families. Don't worry, we'll sort it out for you. Or, worst of all, doing nothing at all. You don't meet our criteria, you don't meet our threshold, go away. We banned 2 words in Leeds, thresholds and targets. If you have a threshold, you have a professional argument between at least 2 professions arguing about your case that you're trying to refer does meet the threshold, does meet the criteria for somebody to take that case on. And you have somebody on the other side of the argument saying, no, it doesn't meet the criteria, it doesn't meet the threshold, go away. So thresholds don't help mature conversations. And targets, I'd urge you to steer clear of targets wherever possible. Talk about changing patterns. If you set a target, it can encourage bad behaviour. And the bad behaviour is you make sure you hit your target, and possibly at the expense of somebody else. Not helpful. An outcome-based accountability, a simple problem-solving approach. You've done some great work here and across Tasmania on results-based accountability, which is the language that's used over here. I'd urge you to hang on to that. That's the origins and the importance of outcomes helping shape conversations that cut across boundaries, cut across those fragments that we talked about earlier on. And I'd urge you to have a look at this. Our whole performance management system now, if you want to use that term, is predicated on an outcome-based accountability model of 3 questions. How much did we do? How well did we do it? Is anybody any better off? Okay? I'd urge you to think about that. Dizzy Rascal, visiting Leeds. Political support is critical. So the top table works because of political leadership. And you've heard some of the political leadership here today. Hold on to that political leadership. That political leadership gives you permission and creates the conditions, helps create the conditions for success. So some clear political intent. And then we did some repair work in the first 18 months. We got off government intervention. That was the stuff that was just broken, not there, not fixed, etc., etc. But then the momentum behind the plan on a city-wide basis meant we just went hell for leather with that for the next 3 years or so. So that's why it became a 5-year journey before we got to any particular milestone at all. It's not quick, but it's just constant reminding people of the plan on a page, what we're doing and how we're doing it, which historically we're very good at, but we often forget why we're doing it. Why we're doing it. What's the purpose of this? Child-friendly Leeds is the centrality of children, an economic regeneration model as much as anything else. I'll just pick one thing out here. In each of those 25 clusters, we don't have a big argument in each of those clusters about which cases are we going to work with, because that would get you into those threshold wars I talked about earlier on. But we have more conversations. But the quick way into this, something we call the top 100 methodology. So don't argue about referrals and seriousness of individual cases. Just get everybody in that multi-agency partnership to bring the top 10. Bring your top 10 as a social worker. Who are the top 10 kids you're most worried about in this particular geography? Head teacher, who are your top 10 you're most worried about? Youth worker, police officer, voluntary worker, whoever you are, bring your top 10 to that conversation. And then let's just see if we can create a list of 100. Because surprise, surprise, when everybody brings their top 10 kids, their top 10 families, there's a huge amount of overlap. It's the same kids, it's the same families. Once you've agreed the top 100, then you're no longer arguing about threshold criteria, admission to services. You're talking about, this is who we're going to work with. How worried do we need to be? Who's best placed to respond to that worry? What are we going to do? The conversation changes from resource allocation to actually the doing side of things. That's the Child Friendly Leeds Choir in the city centre. More on changing culture, this restorative commitment, just trying to get, you can say a lot about culture change, but just trying to, not explicitly using that language, but an adherence to the plan and the behaviours and the aspiration and the vision of a child-friendly city meant slowly but surely this just became, this is how we do things around here. This is just how it works. It's not an argument about it, it's just how it works. So, you might say, well, all right, that's all very good and clever, but is anybody any better off? Have we made a blind bit of difference? So here you go. Here's the 3 obsessions. So this is where we were on children looked after by the state, your equivalent of out-of-home care. This is where we were heading. This is where we've gone. And that's what it means. Look at the financial incentive attached to that. Now, what you can do with that financial incentive is you can start to reinvest significant chunks of that money in early prevention intervention, as early in the life of a child as possible, or as early in the life of a problem as possible. If the system's working the other way and it's full, you're just responding to crises after crises after crises. So that's the first one. Second one, what happens in terms of destinations. That's where we were on young people not in education, employment or training. That's where we were heading. A bit more of a bumpy ride because of the way the economy worked, but that's where we got to. Significant number of young people now actively engaged in education, employment or training. And this is where we were on school attendance, that problem that we didn't have when I arrived earlier on, but that's where we were on primary school, secondary school, that's where we've gone. But just think about this, what that means in Leeds, small percentage increases, because we were in the 90s anyway, but it now means in excess of 400,000 additional school days taken up by children in Leeds than where we were before. So we've now got the lowest looked after figures we've ever had, the highest school attendance we've ever had, and the lowest NEET figures we've ever had. Something has worked somewhere, and I would argue it pays to obsess, and pays to obsess on a few things to get momentum. Behind each of these curves, there's another set of stories about different things that have happened as a consequence. Indicators move in herds. They move in herds. One moves, other things start to move in a positive direction as well. This is called the thing of beauty. Called the thing of beauty because the the story of me trying to get our data folks comfortable with letting me release uncleansed data on a weekly basis is a story on its own. But they weren't happy about this. But the idea was we've got to get something out every week to tell everybody citywide and across the 25 clusters, across the partnership, are we making a blind bit of difference? And it doesn't really matter whether this thing of beauty, our obsession tracker, just against those three things, is red, green or yellow. It's particularly beautiful when it's green. But if it isn't green, it doesn't matter, because its whole purpose is to trigger the right conversations amongst the right people. So at the top table, a conversation about, is it up, down or sideways, what do we need to know about the data? And then down into each of the 25 clusters, each of those clusters would get their local interpretation of this, where they were in each of those clusters on the three obsessions. And remember, the agenda for each of those 25 clusters is, the deal is, you will talk about the three obsessions, you will talk about the priorities, you will talk about the outcomes, you will talk about your contribution to Leeds being a child-friendly city, and then you can talk about what the hell you like. It doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. As long as everybody is having at least one conversation about everything that's on the plan. And that's important because in different parts of Leeds, there will be slightly different emphasis on different priorities. So what we're looking for is something that is unifying in terms of those collective conversations and the collective will, but not uniform. Not uniform. One size does not fit all, but you just try and create that particular way of working. The inspectors came back. We got a clean bill of health, which we were very pleased about. They started to articulate this idea of culture change, language they were using, not us, just and the way these things, these investments in behaviours had started to bring about significant change, and holding our nerve on them made a difference, particularly around the restorative approaches and particularly challenging traditional social work views. When we got the Ofsted inspection report, we didn't do all this for Ofsted inspectors, but this led us to looking at the report. And instead of us going out as a bunch of adults and reading the report to everybody and sharing it and saying, isn't this fantastic, we sat down with a bunch of children in Leeds and they helped us make a film where they took the words of the inspectors and they turned it into a film, which I'm happy to share with you now.
Councils have a passion to get things right for all children.
Success and achievement is celebrated, and there is a good evidence of children and young people's influence on political decision making.
Professionals across the city put children and young people at the heart of their work. Children's services in Leeds benefit from outstanding, inspirational and confident operational and analytical leadership. Leeds is creating an environment where good quality social work can flourish.
The priority for Leeds to be a child-friendly city puts children at the heart of any action taken.
Partners work effectively together to safeguard children and young people.
Families get help very quickly, and that means small problems can usually be sorted out before they become big problems.
Children and young people are spending more days in school, with attendance improving every year.
Staff take the right action quickly when there is a risk of a child being